Okay, by now, most of you know the routine. To try and quench this insatiable thirst, we're going to talk to an expert. And the expert we're going to talk to this week is Professor Paul Iversen, who is uniquely qualified to tell us about the fall of ancient Greece.
All right, Paul, tell us your name and what you do.
I'm Paul Iversen. I'm the chair and associate professor of classics at Case Western Reserve University. And I study Greek history and especially Greek writing on stone or other durable goods.
Durable goods, like pottery and stuff?
Can be pottery, but more bronze.
Okay.
Instead of papyrus in classics, there's a distinction between epigraphers and papyrologists and numismatists who study coins.
Okay. Jeez. Now, all right, I was already going to start to digress. Let's get to the story. Why? You know what this web series is about. It's about how and why civilizations fail. And when I Googled Athens, failure, Greece, downfall, and all that, Cleveland case, you came up as in like top of the list. Why is that?
Probably because I'm the chair of classics and we're a small department and we don't have very many other Hellenists. To be true.
We were talking about your expertise in ancient Greece.
Yes.
Okay. And we're interested in the fall of civilizations. Hint, hint, the United States. But we're trying to interview smart folks like you so that you could tell us maybe a cautionary tale on how, why past civilizations have failed. So with that in mind, how about I start right up? What was the period when the Athenian, am I saying that right? Athenian city-state was at its peak?
I think almost everyone would agree that shortly after the Persian Wars got over in 480, 479 BC to the beginning of the what's called the Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War, which started out in 415 BC. Those years between 480, 479, and 415 BC, that's the period of the height and flower of Athenian civilization. Probably when you think of Athenian people, you're thinking of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Thucydides. You're thinking of Socrates.
Yeah.
They're all in that period. Okay. There are some other greats outside of those bounds. Aristophanes, the comedian, but most of them are writing and living at this time.
All right.
The greatest hits.
The greatest hits. All right. Give me those years again, because it sounded like it was 70 years.
480, 479 BC, and all the way to 415 BC.
415?
Yeah.
So really like 60, 70 years.
Yes. Yeah,
that was it.
That was it. Yeah.
When did they make those, like the Pantheon? When was that?
The Parthenon.
Parthenon.
The Pantheon's in Rome. The Parthenon was built during that time. The Temple of Athena Nike. The great Athenian politician Pericles had a building program that using funds from what's called the Delian League, he was able to divert those funds to beautify the Acropolis and the city of Athens.
Okay.
And so it's during the height of the Athenian Empire in these years when the Parthenon is built.
All right. Now, you mentioned what league was that?
It's called the Delian League. After the Persian Wars got over in 479, the Greeks decided that they needed a league to keep the Persians out of the Aegean. And Sparta had some internal problems with their king Pausanias. He was.
Was this before or after Jared Butler? And you didn't see the movie? the 300 or something?
Oh, this is after that. Yes.
Come on, Paul. Work with me.
I don't know Jared Butler, but I know the movie. Didn't like the movie at all. Yeah.
That movie made money.
Thermopylae was during the Persian War.
Okay. Now, sometimes war, the aftermath of war, is a good thing for arts, for creativity, rebirth. What effect do you think that the Greco-Persian wars had on Greece as a whole, or Athens?
Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag, but for Athens, certainly, I mean, they had to rebuild their city. Their city was destroyed during the Persian Wars.
Didn't they abandon it or
They
something?
abandoned it, yes, they abandoned it. The story is that there was a prophecy that that safety would be found in their wooden walls, and some thought that was these old wooden walls on the Acropolis, and Themistocles said, no, it's our ships, so let's abandon the city and take to our wooden walls, which are our ships, and that's what saved the city.
Wow. That's a radical military tactic.
Right. But Athens had to rebuild, but then the Delian League came in, and Sparta had internal problems, so she sort of withdrew from the external matters, and Athens was able to take control of the Delian League, and eventually she began to force members to make contributions, and she used those monies to build her empire.
All right. And you get into that invasion of Sicily and all that. And
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, eventually.
Now, when you say they, the pronoun you use, they, you're talking the other city-states?
Which they? In what state?
The Delian League.
Yes, because it was a league of several different city-states.
Okay.
Yeah, dozens. And we actually have their tribute lists, the large pentelic marble stones of lists of who the members were and what they contributed.
No shit.
Yeah.
Wow. When I was doing some research, I didn't want to sound stupid when I was so I did a little bit of research, and I like the fact that stuff is left over in writing.
Yes.
And it survived.
Yeah.
And maybe what we're doing here might survive a couple centuries.
It's a very special class of inscriptions. As soon as you see it, you know it belongs. These huge blocks of marble that go up to the ceiling, like
Really?
10, 12 feet high. Beautiful marble with very distinct lettering. They spent a lot of money on it, and they're known as the Athenian tribute lists.
Wow. They didn't have Microsoft Word or
No, exactly.
quick email, hey,
Right.
you owe us some money? No.
Yeah.
It was, so they would all contribute to Athens. Why Athens? Why not Sparta or Corinth?
Well, because Athens had the largest navy, had sacrificed its city during the Peloponnesian War, and because Sparta had these internal problems, they had to recall their king Pausanias, and then he was exiled, and that sort of thing. So and it was mainly a naval alliance of cities, states, and islands that were in the Aegean.
Okay.
And so Sparta was more of a land force.
Right.
And,
The hoplites or something? Or?
Yeah, hoplites, heavily armed land soldiers. Well, you could
You gotta-
transport them on ships and needed to. But
Dude, you've got to watch the movie.
yeah, I saw the movie.
All right. Okay, so Athens was kind of like the pinnacle, the go-to. Sparta was a rival?
Yeah, they ended up being a rival. All the city-states were basically rivals of one another, and each independent, each with their own cultural traditions, in some cases religious traditions. And there were some overarching religious identities, but each one had their own religious calendar for the most part, and
Really?
they had their own dialect often.
Well, how did they unite then to fight the Persians?
It was very difficult. There were only 33 of them, and there are hundreds of them. Only 33 united to fight, and it was a very difficult process, especially because the Persians were coming down from the north,
Right.
and so they were Medizing or converting several city-states as they came down slower and slower, and so the ones that were united. The question was where to make a stand. You could make a stand. There were two major places you could make a stand, at Thermopylae or at the Isthmus south of Athens. If you make it at Thermopylae, it's north of Athens. If you make it at the Isthmus, it's south of Athens. And so there was a disagreement about where exactly to make the stand. And
No
Athens
shit, if
said
you're
that
Athens.
if you make it at the isthmus, then we're just going to go over to the Persians. They'll have our fleet, and good luck with you.
Uh-huh.
And,
All right, very pragmatic.
And
So they went north.
They made the stand there, but then they had to fall back to the isthmus anyway. But then they were able to defeat the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. And then a little bit later, there was a land battle, the Battle of Plataea, and they were able to defeat them there. So between those two things, Athens was in charge of the fleet, more or less, and Sparta was in charge of the land forces.
So after the war, then, they went their separate ways again when there was no threat from Persia?
Yeah, there actually was a first Peloponnesian War starting around 460 BC, and not the great Peloponnesian War that we think of, but it was a smaller one called the First Peloponnesian War. There was constant conflict. Greek history is sort of like a game of King on the Mountain. As soon as any one city-state was more powerful and stronger and could influence,
people would sign on.
Then all the other city-states would band together and gang up on it and knock it off, and then another one would mount, probably one of the ones that were allies, and then the other ones would immediately unite against it.
All right, you can't get in their heads. No one's there, but can you theorize on what motivated this?
It's the same things as today: self control, having your own destiny in your own hands. A lot of it was economic. Just having your own say and not letting anyone else tell you what to do.
Can I throw a provocative word out there? Tribalism?
There was a kind of form of tribalism, but within city-states more so. And there were three major identities, tribes in Greece. There was the Dorians, the Ionians, and the Aeolians. And they shared linguistic, religious, and cultural elements. But in the end, the kind of tribalism it was the city-state more so. Although the city-states did tend to band together along Dorian or Ionic lines more so than not. And then there were constitutional factors, like oligarchies tended to band together more so than democracies. The oligarchic city-states didn't trust the democracies, and they certainly didn't want them to spread into their own city-states. So really...
Can I interrupt and ask something? Some of the city-states were oligarchies.
Yeah.
Did they start out as democracies?
No.
It was just...
Most of them, early on had kingship, and then kingship devolved into oligarchies, and then oligarchies, they really probably more devolved into... There was a period where there were a lot of tyrants in Greece, in the 6th century BC, in the 600, 500 BC especially. There was a series of tyrants.
So before the Greco-Persian War.
And then it was after this period of tyrants, which were sort of... They got more of their support from the people and democratic elements to fight the oligarchic elements, if that makes sense.
Sure it does.
Yeah. And so...
We're doing that here.
So tyrants had support from average people, and the oligarchs were more landed gentry with good names. And then eventually, at Athens, the tyrants were kicked out and democracy was introduced. And then after that, it tended to be, even within Athens, there were more oligarchical elements that were at loggerheads with the more democratic elements. And,
I noticed that. Why did they... first of all, Athens, it was a democracy. What kind of democracy was it?
It's what's called a direct democracy rather than parliamentary or representative.
Or Republican, or...
Yeah, it was... So it was bicameral. They had this body called the Senate, we would translate it, boule in Greek, and that was made up of 500 members, 50 from each of the 10 Athenian tribes. Those tribes were kind of just made up. They were not tribes in the sense of, real tribalism identity. Although they tried to kind of foster a little bit of competition between them, but it was sort of an artificial 10 tribes that were made at a later date. And then, so you had 50 members from each of these 10 tribes, and they were in the Senate. And the Senate had great powers where it could form the agenda that would be voted on.
Okay.
They
By
had
whom?
what's called pro-buleutic function.
Who would vote?
And then you had another body called the Demos, which was made up of all male citizens 18 years of older who were Athenian citizens. This meant that at least your father had to have been born an Athenian citizen. And then later, during the time of Pericles, in I think it was around the
Did they have to show their birth
BC
certificate?
Around 440.
Was there any
BC,
birther movements?
It was a problem. Around in the 440s, I think it was, maybe 430s, Pericles pushed through a law where the mother also had to have been born
No way.
to Athenian
Uh-huh.
parents
Wow.
who were citizens. So,
Was that a form of nationalism?
yeah, I mean, yeah, probably we can imagine, the same forces today that have tax-paying Americans don't want these foreigners, to get state benefits or be able to vote, and so it had a similar.
Did they shoot them?
Not that I know. They didn't have guns back then. They might have.
Yeah. Well, they at least separated them from their parents, right?
No, I don't think they were that
Draconian?
barbaric. Yeah.
All right, so it wasn't. Women weren't allowed to vote.
No, women weren't allowed to vote, and foreigners.
Is that a
weren't
good
either.
law? Are you married? Don't answer that question.
Actually, my wife's Italian, and she just became an American citizen, and she will get to vote in the next election. So she's very happy about that.
I wish I knew any Italian to salute.
Yeah.
Is that how they say it?
Salute.
Salute. Cheers, man. Thanks for doing the interview. All right, so there was a bit of tribalism, and you can't call it nationalism, because, there were city-states.
It was
but they're
national.
all-
It was more nationalism. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
But the nation being the city-state.
The nation being the city-state. Exactly.
Okay. And
Very much so.
now, wasn't Sparta a slave state?
They all were slave state.
Really?
They all had slavery.
Okay.
And the slaves made up a much larger proportion of the population than the citizens did. Sparta was a special kind of slave state, though, where Sparta is in the southern part of Greece called the Peloponnesus, and they were able to assert their authority over much of the Peloponnesus, and on the east side, the peoples there tended to cooperate, and they were called the Laconians.
Okay.
And, for them, they were able to keep all their sort of local magistries and have local control, but they had to contribute troops for war when
Okay.
they were called upon, and they didn't have an independent voice in international affairs, military affairs. So on the west side of the Peloponnesus, especially this
All right,
group
wait a
of-
second, Paul. I just read, what the hell is a Peloponnesus?
The Peloponnesus is the southern peninsula of Greece.
Of Greece. All right,
where
thanks.
Sparta and Corinth. They're in
I just read a book on the Peloponnesian War, and the whole time I'm thinking, what the fuck is a Peloponnesus?
Yeah, it means the island of Pelops. Pelops, the mythical founder of
Okay.
the Peloponnesus. Yeah.
Okay, kind of
And
like
it's really a peninsula, though. It's surrounded on water by all sides, and there's a
Oh.
little spit of land called the Isthmus, right next
Okay.
to Corinth, that connects southern Greece with central Greece. Athens is just north of that isthmus, but it's in central Greece, not in the southern Greece.
All right. Thank you. I guess I could have Googled that.
Yeah. That's why it's called the Peloponnesian War. Yeah.
All right. Where was I? Oh, slave states.
Yeah,
but
so Sparta had...
Didn't Sparta drop the slave state status in order to better fight the Athenians?
No.
No?
No, never.
I got that wrong?
No, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the western people of the Peloponnesus, especially this group of people called the Messenians, they resisted with 3 wars against the Spartans. The Spartans called themselves the Lacedaemonians, and Sparta was the city, but most ancient authors refer to them as the Lacedaemonians. There's a group in Lacedaemonia called the Spartiatai, who were the elite families of the Lacedaemonians. Those were the Spartans, really.
Okay.
So these elite families...
I've got a wealth of information here, and I'm going crazy. I need to hear more. How is it that you had in Athens, the Pantheon, Parthenon. You had Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all that, and just not too far, you had the Spartans, and what we call now a Spartan way of life. All right, how far was Sparta from Athens?
150 miles.
150 miles. Now, that's pretty close. They're fairly close to each other, and yet, Athens was an art creative center. It thrived. It's remembered for till now and beyond, right? Mm-hmm. Sparta, though, we now call it a Spartan way of life, very stark, what have you. Yeah. What happened? What divided them? What separated them besides 150 miles?
Well, you have to remember that 150 miles is a 2 or 3 day march. And the time that it takes for an airplane to fly today to Europe is much less than it would have taken to travel. So there's a fair amount of distance time-wise greater than what it is.
Well, how long did the train take to get there? Wasn't there a subway?
No.
Oh.
So also. Yeah,
it's two
even
different worlds?
Even in Europe today, right, in modern states such as Italy or Germany, you still have very diverse pockets of cultures and dialects and
languages,
things like that. So that that's the way.
Let me ask. Was there separate languages between Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes?
Different dialects that
accents?
They could understand. It involves.
Would you say it's like the southern states in the United States, where those people can't speak English properly, no matter how hard you try?
Definitely.
You going to answer that one, Paul?
Definitely the comedians like Aristophanes. He has.
They poke fun at him.
They poke fun at the Thebans, who are speak the Boeotian dialect.
Okay.
And it's clear that he's sort of mildly making fun of them. Just like Northerners make fun of Southerners in the U.S. or in Italy or in Germany.
Well, I never have.
Like Finland makes fun of Norwegians.
I lived in the Czech Republic, and they constantly mocked the Slovaks.
Right.
All right.
But they were mutually comprehensible. They were the same language, but a different dialects, different spellings and pronunciations. Sometimes different words meant something different. A same word meant something different, or they had a different word for a different same idea.
So, I keep getting back to the United States and drawing similarities. Now, we had our Civil War. And we had at it. How long did the Peloponnesian Wars last?
The Peloponnesian War, the first Peloponnesian War, went from 431 BC to 404 BC. That's 27 years.
27 years. Yeah. All right, our Civil War lasted, 4, 5?
4, yeah.
Yeah. What motivates someone to have at it for
Right.
20 some odd years.
There was a hiatus in between 421 and 415, so there was a 6-year hiatus in that period. But
They took lunch breaks?
It just took longer. You know, they didn't. Prior to the Peloponnesian War, they didn't have year-round military operations. You know, they didn't fight very much during the winter season. They did. You know, they started to do that more and more.
Skirmishes.
Skirmishes, things like that. Just, you know, they were completely agricultural societies, right? So, you know, during the good fighting season, they were also farmers. So there was,
isn't that why they had slaves, though? Didn't they use the slaves?
They had slaves,
So
but you know, you needed somebody to oversee
the slaves
it as well. Yeah, as well.
It's so complex. If you're going to be in a constant state of warfare, it sounds like it's complex.
Yeah. And a lot of it, you know, wasn't. It was rare where the big armies would come together in big hand-to-hand combat battles. Normally, it was more skirmishes and feeling one another out and just having to be on guard. You know, so.
Or like a Vietnam kind of thing where you'd fight somewhere else over something, I don't know, extrapolated or theorized or.
Yeah,
or,
I mean,
help me.
It takes a lot of resources to field an army, and it takes a lot of social cohesion, you know, and
training.
It's not a natural thing for humans to want to leave their home and risk their lives to fight and do that kind of thing. So
we've done a couple episodes on that.
So, you know, they had to create an ideology of the. They had to transfer this idea of the warrior and the Iliad who's fighting for his family and his father's land.
What motivates someone
That's right.
to leave home and go to war and
fight for their at the time of the Iliad and Odyssey, like you know, Dark Ages, 900, 800 BC. There wasn't a city-state yet, and so these great chiefs fought for their own kingdoms, which often were handed down from their father. And so they fought for their father's land. And, you know, they were individuals, and we don't hear much about the small guy fighting with them and so forth. But eventually the city-states begin to emerge in Greece, and that ideology of fighting for your father's land gets transferred to fighting for your fatherland. Your city-state and its surrounding territory.
All right, and that harkens me back to our Civil War again. We interviewed the head of the history department at Gettysburg, a Civil War aficionado, and I asked him this question: what motivated Southern dirt poor Southern people to go fight for an oligarchy?
You know, I think it was a cultural identity. It was a cultural identity that, and it still is today, right? And those, you know, people don't want to be told what to do. They didn't want to be told they couldn't have slaves. They didn't want to be told.
Are you talking about the South or Greece?
I'm talking about the South. Yeah.
Okay.
Greece, everybody at that time, nobody wanted to be a slave, but nobody questioned the morality
The
of
hierarchy,
slavery.
the morality.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And every culture owned slaves just about, and it wasn't so much a racial thing like it was in the American experience, but it was, you know, if your city-state lost in a fight, all the men were, just about all the men are killed, and the women and children are enslaved.
Jesus. Wow, you don't want to lose that war.
Yeah, you don't want to lose that war.
And what a way to die back then.
And anyone could become a slave, especially earlier. Like, you know, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is worried that he could be, you know, treated like he's a slave and could be enslaved. And it's only his noble bearing and the fact that people are generous to him and welcome him, and by the time he gets home, pile wealth back upon him, that he is does not fall into the state of becoming a slave himself.
But I thought, didn't he win?
He
Odysseus?
Yeah, but
in the Trojan War?
Yeah, he won, but then he lost his ship, gets shipwrecked, he loses all his belongings, and nobody knows who he is. So,
not even his wife, right?
Right.
All right, Paul. So we talked before the interview started about Jared Diamond.
Yeah.
That fucking asshole who won't give me an interview. And I mean that with all loving. No, fuck him. Anyways, he lists 5 factors on how civilizations fail. The human impact on the environment, climate change, friendly neighbors failing, hostile neighbors, and dysfunctional political, cultural influences. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with those 5? You know what I mean?
I'm familiar, yes.
All right. When we think of Athens, when we think of Greece, God, is it Greece that failed, or is it Athens? When I think of the fall of Athens, but it was actually the fall of Greece, wasn't it?
It's more the fall of Greece. Yeah, we tend, when we think of the classical period, we are thinking of Athenian culture, and the Athenian Empire, and Athenian art, architecture, and literature. Mm-hmm. But in fact, Athens was just one city-state amongst many, and was not equivalent to Greek culture. But it pretty much was the fall of Greece, and all of those factors were factors, I would say, but the biggest
not
one,
so much the climate change thing, was it?
Probably not. No, but they, practices in farming and things like that.
Okay,
deforestation. Yeah, the deforestation.
Well, like
was a big
Athens,
problem, yeah.
didn't Athens? They didn't have much agriculture, and so when the war started, didn't they all have to go in the city walls, and that's when the plague started?
That's right.
Yeah. I told you I did a little research on that.
So, I would, the biggest reason was the inter-city-state conflicts, constant
dysfunction.
war, the political dysfunction and the constant warfare between city-states, which allowed other peoples that were on the periphery, like the Macedonians, to sort of stay out of it, as these large, powerful Greek city-states weakened one another over decades and centuries, and eventually Macedonia was able to
swoop in.
Yeah, swoop in. Yeah.
All right. My director just said I need to be a little bit more provocative, so let me be provocative.
Right.
Philip of Macedon, sitting there watching everybody in Greece fuck around, fighting, swoops in, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much kicks ass, and then he becomes the ruler of Greece, right?
That's right.
Is there any threat to the United States like Philip currently?
Of course there is. And, I would say on the world stage that, obviously China represents the largest economic power, and it's a different political system as well. And we see this trade war going on right now. It's not just about economics, although that's a big part of it, but it's also cultural. It's different forms of government, different attitudes about what's fair, what's right, and I definitely think that as if the West, the U.S., if we act in a arrogant way towards our allies, like NATO allies, then we weaken those bonds. Then we risk, pissing off our allies and having
pissing off Corinth or pissing off Thebes,
right? Exactly.
And as opposed to being inclusive.
I don't think much has really changed in the world. It's just the scale has changed. You know, whereas before Athens was like, I wouldn't say the U.S. was like Sparta. Let's say. Let's say Athens is more like the European Union or Europe, and you know, Macedonia.
More of a cultural center and all that.
Yeah.
It's
So
former trading partner, former NATO ally. Now, all right. So, what motivates, whether it's Athens or the United States, to piss on our allies?
you know, you get politicians who.
So are we getting into number 5 and Jared Diamond's thing, dysfunctional political and cultural influences?
Yeah, I mean, you eventually have politicians whose platform is nativist, right? And
What does that mean? I can't even spell that.
It means that they're only concerned about their immediate constituents who vote for them and making them happy. So,
Similar to Athens being
yeah,
150 miles from Sparta. Back then it was a long way away.
Right.
And short-sightedness.
Yeah, short-sightedness. You know, and you know, especially, you know, there, if you want to, you know, you want American goods to be, you know, American manufacturers. You want them to be successful, and you want to please them and the workers that work at those plants. Then you say, okay, let's slap tariffs on European goods, even though they're our allies. That's happening right now, where under the guise of
Nativism?
Under the guise of not self-defense, but what is it? It's a security.
Oh, national security.
National security. Under the guise of national security, for instance, there's a threat to, say, put tariffs on Mercedes-Benz cars, which actually, you know, they have a factory in North Carolina or South Carolina, one of those, right? And you know, there's no national security threat from them from a military standpoint.
There is from South Carolina.
So,
have you ever met anybody from South Carolina? I'm frightened.
Yeah.
Anyways, so all right. So we're doing something similar to what Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes did. That maybe we're not sending a bunch of hoplites. Again, Paul,
there's an unquenchable desire to, you know, of wishes and wants in human nature, and so you know, the saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Somebody who's in a position of power and authority will tilt the playing field to benefit him or herself, and eventually the people around him or the nation states around such a country decide that, you know, it's better to risk going with somebody else, or maybe, you know, knocking off, you know, it's like King on the Mountain again, you know, when somebody gets to be overbearing and tyrannical on top of the mountain, not content with a reasonable amount of power, resources, that sort of thing. Others, you know, aren't going to go along with it forever.
So you're saying we should revolt? A coup? What was that, 410 Athens?
Boy, it's a tough, you know, it's really, American politics are tough, right? You know, it's always
all right,
a
well, let me
difficult,
get that.
it's a difficult thing.
I need more of your time, because now you've opened Pandora's box.
All right.
All right. Plato.
Yeah.
Why was he a critic of democracy?
Well, he's not the only one. Most of the ancient authors...
Me too, by the way.
Yeah. Most of the ancient authors were of the well-to-do set, and
he was no exception.
Almost every one of them criticized Athenian democracy. And, of course, we all know that democracy is messy and difficult. And
no shit.
Yeah. You know, but even so, I think Churchill, what he noted was that you know, democracy is the worst of all forms of government, but the others are worse that have been tried from time to time. So,
and I can't remember who the original guy who said it was. Democracies result in the people get what they deserve. Was that Alex de Tocqueville?
I don't know.
Yeah. And another quote from Churchill, which I love, is the United States will always try every possibility and get it always wrong until they finally get something right.
Yeah, that's a Churchill one again, too. I think the way I heard it was America will always do the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities.
You said it much better, which is why you're a teacher and I'm a stupid movie maker.
But yeah, so it's tough, right? It's tough. I think Plato, he had sort of 5 different constitutions. He thought we start out with aristocracy, which he favored as being the best, and he conceived of as being ruled by philosopher kings. I don't think he was a very good judge of human nature, though.
I disagree, Paul. I disagree. Didn't he say something like he had the fictional discourse with Socrates in the Republic, where he's saying, why have a democracy? Because 99% of the people are fucking stupid. Why should they vote for a ruler when they don't know what the fuck they want?
Yeah, but 100%
that's a direct quote.
100% of people are corrupt when given power.
Is that right?
So, at least that's human nature as far as I see it. Now, he thought that aristocracy was the best and that there were these wise philosopher kings who would do things for others. And I don't think such people really exist, or if they do, they don't exist for long. And he even recognized that, because then he said, that will degenerate into a timocracy, which is still good and better than a democracy, but the people there aren't as deserving and they aren't the best. And then that will devolve into an oligarchy. And then that will degenerate into a democracy, and then a democracy will degenerate into a tyranny. Now, certainly that cycle, I mean, there's something to say for that, right? There's something to say for that.
We've seen it before.
Yeah, we've seen it before.
Are we seeing it now?
I think you could make a case that, certainly democracy can be frustrating. So each partisan side gets tired of the struggle, and they just want somebody to institute their policies, and they're looking for some kind of strong man or woman to just, say, fuck it, let's just do it our way, and who cares what the others say, and who cares.
Gordian knot kind of resolve.
So,
that's your boy, right?
Yeah. So, I think right now it's clear, that President Trump and his supporters are arguing for right now a period of very strong executive power. But if the voters put in a Democrat, I'm sure they won't say that anymore, right? So it just it is a problem, though, with ceding so much power to the executive branch over time. And I think Rome is a better model for this, where eventually the dysfunction of the republic led to the Principate, but the Principate was enacted under the guise of bringing back the old republic.
Our viewers never got to hear from a professor on the fall of Rome. Are you I don't know. Are you familiar with that conflict?
Sure.
Yeah.
A bit, yeah.
Inside joke, audience.
I might have been a part of that failure.
All right. So we have an executive branch in the United States becoming more and more autocratic, and we have a blend of oligarchy in that, or aristocracy.
Yeah.
In Jared Diamond's scheme of things, where the fuck are we, and what chance do we have?
Well, I mean, we have all of those things
I know
going
what, Paul.
on, but
I know what. We should head to the wooden walls. we could get on the ships and just fucking abandon the place. Brilliant, dude. No,
Well,
seriously, what do you think?
Well, I think we just need to have another election and hope to God that a majority of the Electoral College
Well said.
votes out the president. That's the best way in our system. I think, it's a two-party system for all intents and purposes, and both parties always have a good chance of winning. They have, they're okay chance. So we just need to win the next election in 2 years. That's what we. That's not going to change everything. It's not going to change everything. I think we're kind of stuck with the system we have in this two-party rule. I don't see anything really changing that anytime soon.
I do.
And,
I do. And it's more depressing than your optimistic ivory tower college professor answer. All right? I think that what's going to happen is you're going to have the South being as ignorant and backwards as they've always been. And you're going to have the Midwest becoming more ignorant and backwards. And I'll use an example, the Scopes trial.
Yeah, Scopes monkey trial.
Exactly.
Dayton, Tennessee.
All right. Dude, I thought you were a Greek historian, but you actually, rural Tennessee history. But back then, the evangelicals, oh my God, Timothy Beale. Anyways, back then, the evangelicals, they kind of went south, if you will, metaphorically speaking. They were so embarrassed by what they did and how they were perceived by the rest of the country that they left the political arena. But nowadays, stupid rules. Nowadays, the southernization of the Midwest is becoming entrenched. You have people wearing T-shirts here in Ohio that say, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat."
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I think...
And you have the Electoral College.
Right.
I think you have a formula. I think Greece lasted, what do you say, 70 years at its peak? We've gone...
About 70 years since World War II.
Yeah. Dude, did you see our last episode?
No.
How prescient. Wow. All right. Tell me I'm an idiot. I'm just pessimism times 10. Give me some good news, Paul.
Well, the question is whether or not, in our country, whether or not, like places like the Mahoning Valley in 2016, they voted for Trump.
Dude,
right.
We have viewers in Australia, Denmark. What's the Mahoning Valley?
Mahoning Valley is a place east of Cleveland where it's centered around a town called Youngstown, which was the heart of the industrial portion of Ohio. And these voters used to vote Democratic. They were union members. There were good factory jobs.
A lot of people like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato came from Youngstown, right?
Yeah.
Oh, no. All right. Anyways, sorry to interrupt. You were saying.
Yeah. But they voted Democratic and, were slightly more progressive minded, or at least they were. And the parties have changed so much too. It's difficult to say, but a lot of the Midwest has to do with the loss of manufacturing jobs, and the South is gaining while the Midwest is losing. The
kind
South,
of a reverse
and
of the 60s.
The South, the South, there are a lot of places in the South that are becoming more progressive as Northerners move to the South. Like
Georgia,
Atlanta, around Atlanta and places like that, North Carolina.
Don't get me started on
right.
that.
So we're sort of reversing roles where, because the economy is growing in the South, those are where the jobs are, and the smart, talented people are going there to earn money. And so
people with a car that can drive more than 800 miles?
Here the Republican Party is playing on, the Southerners, they
are you going to get fired for this interview?
No. I mean, the South has lots of advantages. They have good weather, right? They have.
They don't have good weather. The mosquitoes are like pterodactyls.
Well, people like living in warmer weather more than cold weather like Cleveland.
All right, Paul. We've covered a lot of ground. We've covered the invasion of the Persians into Greece, the subsequent result of the Greek success in that war. We've talked about Socrates, Plato, not so much Aristotle. But we talked about an area of the world in a certain period of time that thrived and yet internally seemed to want to self-destruct.
Yeah.
I propose that the United States is in a self-destruct period. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm an idiot.
No, I think you're right. I think if we continue on the path that we are on, that it is self-destructive. I mean, we're the ones that built the United Nations. We're the ones that built the WTO. You know, all of these international institutions that were to find a way to avoid conflict. And who is the country in the world leading the complaints and the movement to destroy the UN, destroy the WTO?
And NATO.
And NATO right now, including NATO, yes, NATO, the United States. And so, you know, I think, you know, our European allies and friends, there's going to be blowback for this sort of thing if it goes on too long. I think they're all just sort of holding their breath right now and hoping that in 2 years from now, the election will change things. But if that election doesn't change things, you know, who knows what will happen in the next 4 years after that.
But isn't there going to be a ripple effect? Isn't there going to be an echo that we're unstable idiots in the United States? That every 4 years there's a chance that we're going to do something really fucking self-destructive and stupid?
Well,
And by the way, Paul, let me be even more provocative. Shouldn't, all right? Oh, God, this is a whole nother episode. And but real quick, Director, shouldn't states like California, New York, Washington, shouldn't they just say, fuck you, and just say, we're out of this?
I think, you know, a house divided cannot stand, as Lincoln once said. I think that's impractical. It's not going to happen, and so we're stuck with our neighbors,
Our family,
yeah,
the crazy uncle,
yeah,
at the Thanksgiving
right.
table.
We're stuck with them, I think, and you know, I don't see the voters that lost their factory jobs in the upper Midwest, you know, unless they see economic results that improve their lives, things like that. You can only go so long on cultural war if you don't have any result. You know, the farmers in the Midwest that are now paying for the trade war with China, you know, they were thinking that it was going to be easy and it was going to be over in 1 year and that sort of thing. But as, you know, game theory tells us this is going to go on for some time, probably, right? You know, both leaders have to save face. So what's going to happen at the next election, I don't know, but I'm optimistic. We could lose it. I mean, it could be lost again, but it can be won, too. It can be won.
All right.
And that can help. You know, I mean, like our allies in Europe, yeah, they've got to be worried, right? Because they thought Reagan was so bad.
Oh, shit, I lived in Europe during Cheney and Bush.
Right. And then it couldn't get worse. Then there was Cheney and Bush, and they thought they were horrible. It couldn't get worse.
I swear to God.
It got worse with Trump. It can get worse. Certainly it can get worse, but it can also get better. And usually there's a
Ebb and flow.
ebb and flow, yeah.
I'm 62, going on 63. I don't want to wait.
Yeah, well,
I'm tired of fucking waiting.
Just remember, you know, I mean, Obama couldn't change very much, right? But who would have thought that a black man could get elected in the United States in 2008? Who would have thought that, and then get reelected? And he did. He did.
What happened to you Ohioans? What happened to that?
Trump was able to tap into that Mahoning Valley factory worker, mainly white Protestant factory worker. That
now, what
is
happens if
worrying.
California invaded Ohio? All right, just bombed the piss out of it. Like Athens, we'd kill all the males, and then we'd enslave the women and children.
Well,
Wouldn't that be better for the United States?
I think most of the big military bases are in the South.
Oh,
The federal ones, not the
We're
state
fucked.
militia. Forget that.